Good evening and welcome, and thank you very much for coming. This seems a very opportune moment to be speaking about Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Its first production here in London, which was its first ever production in English, took place almost exactly 60 years ago, and roughly a mile from where we are this evening. So that makes it seem appropriate. And in addition to that, some of you will remember that between the first and the second acts of the play, some leaves appear on the tree. And coming to the Museum of London this evening, I was aware that leaves were appearing on the trees. Now, the central character of this play, it could be argued, remains absent throughout. Godot never appears. In fact, he may not exist. But he lives on in our language, in everyday language, independent of both the author and the play. Godot has been likened to Dracula and described as a pop culture ghost. In other words, Godot, like Dracula, has become very much part of our cultural awareness, whether or not we know the writers or their works. And Godot reappears all over the place, and in very different kinds of places, from medical texts to advertisements. I've found advertisements for jobs, cars, cosmetics, which all reference Godot. And interestingly, he's particularly prominent in professional medical literature, articles written by medics. And here are some examples. Waiting for Godot, a common-sense approach to medical treatment of endometriosis. Well, endometriosis, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't, is a medical condition where part of the womb lining is found outside the womb. Waiting for Godot, the anxiety created by diagnostic medical testing. Well, I think we're all familiar with that. If we've ever had a test, it can seem like a very long time before we get a result. In fact, we sometimes don't get a result at all. Then understanding the impact of waiting for Godot, bracket, a doctor's call. In other words, it fills us with anxiety and we don't know when the doctor's call is going to come, if at all. And political cartoonists are also very keen on Godot. Here are some examples. Godot, no, I'm waiting for a 3% yield on the 10-year treasury. And that is very obviously Vladimir and Estragon. And here we have another one. In our coalition, better things will turn up. The Conservatives, Cameron, and the Liberal Democrats, Clegg. And then waiting for Godot. And then I think one that works a bit better, in NHS admissions, apparently we're waiting for Dr. Godot. And there they are on their trolleys in a corridor. Now, of course, this is really very trivializing of this very, very great and very profound play. But I do think it's interesting that a play that I think most people would describe as in some ways quite difficult should nevertheless have elements of it have found their way in to our language. We all know if someone uses the expression waiting for Godot, that it means we're waiting, and we're waiting rather hopelessly. So it's also the case, I think, that situations crop up in everyday life, which we would describe as Beckettian. And Alan Schneider, who was one of Beckett's directors, and probably the director that Beckett had the most respect for, he claimed that Godot was, and I quote, no longer a play, but a condition of life. No longer a play, but a condition of life. And this represents, I think, another step from the name Godot and the idiom waiting for Godot, that the whole play has come to conjure a condition of life. In other words, a philosophical description of our being in the world, that this play communicates something of our own understanding of what it is to be in the world. So you might suppose that given, well, if you accept that it is a difficult play, then you might suppose that it would remain a rather kind of recherche cult piece, for a sort of small number of people who've been caught up in Beckett's vision, part of a subculture. But of course, this isn't the case at all. Beckett's Waiting for Godot is very much mainstream culture, and the number of productions of Beckett's play that are put on every year is enormous. Now, the origins of the play were as sort of unlikely and as inauspicious. Beckett was actually struggling to write 3 prose works, which he was finding particularly difficult, and he decided, in effect, to take a kind of break from these 3 novels and give himself a bit of time off to do something very different. The plays are Malloy, Maloney Dies, and The Unnameable. And he actually described the process of writing this extraordinary play, and I quote, as relaxation to get away from the awful prose I was writing at the time. So, however you understand the play, and that's what we'll be exploring this evening, as far as Beckett was concerned, there was a sense of release in writing this piece of theatre, which contrasted with what he was finding very, very arduous, which was producing this trilogy of prose works. And he wrote the play in just 4 months. It's not a very long play, but nevertheless, it seems to me astonishing that something so beautifully wrought should have been produced really very quickly. But bringing it to birth on stage, as opposed to simply writing it, was a much more protracted and painful process, which I'll describe in a moment. So most of you will know the play, but in case you don't, can it be briefly summarized? I don't think so. So let's have a go. Now, the rhetorical device that I've used here, put simply statement, can it be briefly described, and contradiction, no, I don't think so, is typically Beckettian. Exchanges between Vladimir and Estragon often follow this pattern of antiphrasis. So, for example, Vladimir says, "Ah, yes, the 2 thieves. Do you remember the story?" And Estragon replies, "No." Vladimir, "Shall I tell it to you?" "No." "It'll pass the time." 2 thieves, crucified, and so on. So can the play be briefly summarized? I don't think so. So here goes. Nothing to be done. The play opens with this quasi-pathetic line. Bathos, of course, is the rhetorical device that pulls the rug out from underneath you. Its effect is one of anticlimax, created by a lapse in mood from the sublime to the trivial or ridiculous. And I'll say a little bit more about the theatrical conventions in the late 1950s in a moment. But even without considering the broader theatrical context, in other words, most theatregoers' expectations when going to a new piece of theatre, it's very obvious that this line, "nothing to be done," doesn't really draw you in and give you a sense that a drama is about to unfold. If anything, it's the kind of line you might expect at the end of a modern tragedy. Nothing to be done. But for this to be the first line of the play subverts all our expectations. And this bathos is soon added to this bathos is another device, which is an obviousness that this play doesn't really have a plot. Nothing to be done and no plot. Rather, we're faced with an apparently inert situation in which we, the audience, wait, just as the 2 tramps wait, for something to happen, sometimes finding ways to pass the time. The play is riddled with the expression, passing the time. How do we pass the time? It'll pass the time. And the audience begins to question what this means. Isn't all life a matter simply of passing the time? And just as we have this sense of stasis in time, of time suspended, so we have a strong sense of anonymous location in terms of place. The stage direction reads, a country road, a tree, evening. Not the country road, the tree, but a, unspecified. And the use of this indefinite article a has a generalizing effect. Could be anywhere. All is indefinite. And on this bare stage that could be anywhere, at a time that could be any time, there are two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon. And their conversation, in so much as it is conversation, because very often one doesn't actually reply to the other, so in that sense it doesn't really constitute conversation, is often very mundane. And their language is very simple. In other words, it's made up of high-frequency words. In other words, words that are used very, very frequently in everyday language. It's not an abstruse, refined, difficult lexis. The actual vocabulary, the actual basic language of the play is very, very simple. It's very much the language of everyday speech and common idiom. And paradoxically, it's because of this simplicity that a lot of what's said can either relate to mundane, ordinary experience, or it can resonate far beyond the mundane. So to give you an example, nothing to be done, the opening line of the play. Now, the original French version, because Beckett wrote this play first in French, 2 years before he produced the English version. I call it a version because I don't think it is altogether a translation of the French text, but the same play in another language. I don't think it's quite the same thing. And the French text, the first line of the French text is rien à faire. And this, I think, could be translated as, for example, it's no good, it's no use, there's nothing for it, nothing to be done about it. And what Beckett opted for, of course, was nothing to be done, and the about it is simply implied. And that it is free-floating. Pronouns to be pronouns, it as a pronoun, has to refer to a preceding noun, but there isn't any noun that it refers back to, and therefore we're left very unclear as to what this expression means. The it might refer to the action of removing his boot. In other words, it's hopeless trying to get my boot off. But pared down to nothing to be done, the line takes on an equally abstract and philosophical resonance. There's nothing to be done in life. There's nothing to be done about life. And this is a declaration of philosophical pessimism, of the utmost seriousness. So this single first line, this simple expression, nothing to be done while the tramp is wrestling with his boot, is both a statement of the impossibility of removing his boot, and what could be more humdrum, what could be more mundane, what could be less poetic. And at the same time, it could be understood as a declaration of nihilistic despair, and what could be more darkly profound. So, do we in effect have to opt for one or other understanding of this line? Or do we have to accept the uncomfortable truth of both? Do we actually, in some sense, understand a kind of binary expression? Well, next year, which will be my fourth as Professor of Rhetoric, I want to explore various features of rhetoric, rhetoric basically being the art of persuasion, but really how language works in relation to various classic literary works. And one rhetorical trope that we'll be thinking about is metaphor. Now, metaphor, by definition, brings two things into relationship. Both coexist linguistically. Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage, from As You Like It, which is probably one of the most cited metaphors in the English language, essentially brings the idea of the world and the stage into relationship. All the world's a stage. And the world is likened to a stage, suggesting that life and theatre are one and the same thing. Now, maybe we can understand the opening of Godot in a similar kind of way. The frustrations of not being able to remove your boot is a metaphor for the ultimately insurmountable frustrations of human life. We don't opt for a single understanding, I think, but we're invited, consciously or not, and I think watching a powerful production, probably not, to accept this sort of overlap of quasi-metaphorical meaning. And of course, some linguistic theorists have suggested that language is by nature metaphorical. It can't be anything else. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Metaphor is for next year. So back to Beckett's play. So after the business with the boot, we learn that the two characters on the stage are waiting for a character named Godot. And while waiting, passing the time, two other characters appear, the domineering Pozzo with his whip, and Lucky, his servant, who has a rope tied round his neck, suggesting that he's treated like an animal or a slave, and also Lucky is burdened with all their baggage. And I think we're immediately struck by the equality of, or the relative equality of Vladimir and Estragon's relationship, because we've already seen them interacting together, and the inequality of Pozzo and Lucky, very much, as I say, master and slave or master and animal. Conversations continue, including a long, rambling, incoherent speech by the otherwise silent Lucky. Pozzo and Lucky then leave the stage, and just before the act ends, a boy appears, and he informs them that Godot won't be coming that day, but, and I quote, surely tomorrow. And again, the apparently simple expression, surely tomorrow, is ambiguous. Although the adjective sure means certain, the adverbial expression weakens the certainty and means something more like most likely, surely tomorrow. Doesn't have that same certainty. And perhaps there's even a sense that anyone who uses that expression is afraid that the certainty isn't so sure. Surely tomorrow. I'm not really sure. And after the boy has left, Vladimir and Estragon decide to leave also. But the act ends with a typical antiphrasis. Yes, let's go. But the stage direction answers back. They do not move. Curtain. And so the first of the two acts of this remarkable play comes to a close. And in the second act, there's this uncanny sense of near repetition of the first act, both in terms of speech and action. There's waiting, there's conversation, Pozzo and Lucky appear, and so does the boy. But this time, Pozzo has become blind and Lucky is dumb. And after they've left, the boy arrives and delivers a similar message about Godot's likely appearance. Vladimir and Estragon discuss suicide. For want of a rope, they postpone their suicides until the following day. Unless Godot comes, Vladimir adds. And Estragon then asks, and if he comes? To which Vladimir answers, we'll be saved. The act and play ends as the first act did. Estragon says, yes, let's go. And the stage directions read, they do not move. And so the play comes to an end. So how do we begin to make sense of this play, which, in the words of one witty Irish critic, Vivian Mercier, he said, Waiting for Godot has achieved a theoretical impossibility, a play in which nothing happens, and yet keeps audiences glued to their seats. What's more, since the second act is a subtly different reprise of the first, he's written a play in which nothing happens twice. Well, of course, things do happen, but what happens in this play is not what happens in other plays. And I think we need to begin considering the text before we consider the text as a potential event. This is one of the things that I've talked about in my previous lectures about theatre. One can talk about a play as a text, but of course the text is a pretext for a performance, for an event, for something which is ephemeral, which is a one-off. And videoing it or filming it doesn't in any sense change that. Theatre is about a live, one-off performance. In Beckett's theatre, there are very often contradictions between the different aspects of theatre, between what's said, what's done, between the actions on the stage, between gestures and so on. Just as when a character says, "let's go," and the stage direction describes stasis, they do not move. And silence, the absence of language and sound, silence isn't simply a matter of no one speaking, but also no action, because any action will make some sound, communicates too. Silence signals a breakdown of train of thought. It's an interesting metaphorical expression, train of thought, of communication, of ideas. One might even say that Beckett created his own peculiar kind of silence, and the critic Norman Berlin describes this very well. Godot makes silence as important as dialogue. Not only the kind of silence that comes to us all in everyday life, or the silence of the characters in their anguish, but a peculiar Beckettian silence, the presence of an absence that is palpable, touching the heart of existence, as if in the beginning was the silence, then came the word, then the silence again. Well, maybe Berlin here, with his allusions to the creation story in John's Gospel, gets a little carried away. But his point is that Waiting for Godot, when well produced, does make something of silence that I don't think any other play that I know does. Silence begins to represent, within the whole context of the play, absence, negation, stasis, and these suggest or become metaphors for a kind of philosophical pessimism. And I think this idea can be illuminated better by reference to the artist Giacometti. He had, I think, a very particular insight into the play. His work is variously described as expressionist, surrealist, cubist, formalist, but I think all that really matters in relation to Beckett and what Beckett was trying to do is that they were both moving away from naturalistic forms. And he and Beckett were very good friends, and Beckett asked Giacometti to design the tree, which of course is the only piece of scenery essentially, for the 1961 production of En attendant Godot in Paris. Now, Giacometti's figures, as you'll know, are very much these stick-like forms. And when you see a group of Giacometti figures, you do get a sense of a woodland in winter with bare trees. There's a very sort of close sense that trees and the human figure are like one another. I'm sure we've all seen trees, particularly in winter, that take on a very human form. And I think it's obvious why Beckett asked Giacometti to produce the tree. There they are, Giacometti on the left and Beckett on the right, and there's Giacometti's tree, not very representational in the sense of naturalistic, and really rather like his figures. Now, they didn't know in the 1950s when they were working, or 1960s rather, when they were working on this production, that humans and trees, I hope I've got this right, and I hope someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but humans and trees apparently share about 60% of their DNA in common. Seems unlikely to me, but that's what the scientists tell us. And looking at Giacometti's figures and his tree, I think this comes across. We're all simply living matter, and we're all going to die. The tree will die, and Vladimir and Estragon will die, and they may die by the tree, because after all, when they contemplate suicide, they're thinking about suicide by hanging from the tree. Giacometti sculpted the human form almost compulsively. There are huge numbers of these figures. And he said he wasn't sculpting the human figure, but I quote, "the shadow that is cast." That he wasn't sculpting the human figure, but the shadow that is cast. And I think this idea of form and shadow it finds a parallel in Beckett's fascination with the relationship between language and silence. Both are presences. Silence is, in effect, a presence. It's the presence of an absence. And the shadows are the presence of the form. They stand in a crucial relationship. So before we go on to think a bit about the play as event, I want to say a few words about the writerly context. It is a deeply puzzling play, and can the performance context tell us anything useful? Well, on the day that Beckett started writing, that was on Saturday the 9th of October, 1948, the London theatre scene had various showings on offer by established playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and Terence Rattigan, and relative newcomers like Tennessee Williams. The Glass Menagerie was on. Around the same time, John Osborne's Look Back in Anger was being shown, and O'Neill's great work of realistic theatre, Long Day's Journey into Night. So that was what was going on around the same time. And Long Day's Journey is essentially a work of psychological realism. It's about addiction. It's about characters who dissimulate, who lie, who let each other down, who recriminate, who accuse, who deny. There are also moments of affection and hope and solace. And the work's one very much of high emotion as well as highly charged psychological realism, and I think it could hardly be at a further remove from Beckett's play. So I think if we think about the plays that were being staged around the same time as Beckett's Waiting for Godot, what we sense most strongly is that Godot was doing something extraordinarily original and iconoclastic. How was the play received? Well, in France it fared slightly better because there'd actually been an abridged version of the play broadcast on radio, and that gave Édition de Minuit the confidence to publish the play as a text. And all this was before, so that was in 52, and then the play premiered in 53. So the Parisian, at least the Parisian scene, already had some sense of what the play was like before it was staged. It was staged by Roger Blin, who had taken it on some years earlier, but was quite tentative about how he was actually going to stage it. And in the end, the venue was the Théâtre de Babylone, which holds about 220 people, which I think is roughly the size of this auditorium. And the stage was 20 feet wide, which is, I don't know, roughly between these two monitors, maybe slightly wider. So a tiny, tiny theatre. Blin simply didn't have the confidence to try to put it on anywhere grander or where there could be a larger audience. Some people left during the course of the play, obviously completely baffled. Very few people laughed at what I think we as an audience now seeing it would recognise is potentially very comical. But the critics were much more impressed. And there were various writers and other playwrights, Jean Ennui, for example, who wrote a very laudatory review. Robbe-Grillet, the French academic and novelist, he was also extremely impressed, as was Audie Berthy, playwright, poet, and novelist. They all rallied to Beckett and Blin's support. And so the first run passed off reasonably well. In the UK, it was also the critics who were really excited by the play, and the public much less so. It premiered in the Arts Theatre Club in Covent Garden. But one of the difficulties was this was still a period in which there could be censorship for theatre, and the Lord Chamberlain's work on the play meant that religious and sexual allusions had all been excised, and of course suicide by hanging was still a crime. And so the various adjustments that were made to the play left Beckett despairing. He wrote to his publisher friend Barney Rossett, "His incriminations are so preposterous that I'm afraid the whole thing's off. The things I'd expected and was half prepared to amend, reluctantly, but also passages that are vital to the play, and impossible either to alter or suppress. All this had come out." And what about Beckett's own life? I mean, is there a sense in which this play should be understood, at least in part, as autobiographical? Well, Beckett and his partner Suzanne had to hide in the unoccupied zone in southern France, and the occupation had obviously been a time of extraordinary anxiety and uncertainty. And although during the post-occupation period there was a certain kind of euphoria that manifested itself particularly in the cities, in Paris most notably, there were serious shortages of food and other things and general political instability. There were miners' strikes up in the north around Lille, and these were very aggressively suppressed by the French riot police using tear gas. And the workers in France's power stations were on strike. The electricity output dropped to about 50%, and there was the likelihood of fuel rationing. And so there are clearly some links between the contemporary moment and the play, the presence of violence, which is very important in the play, the food shortages, they have almost nothing, the odd carrot, and a general sense of uncertainty certainly pervades the play and was very much a feature of the times. And in terms of mood, Beckett was pessimistic. The Second World War had just come to an end. And I think this emerges very interestingly from these three prose works that he was working on around the same time. So I'll just read a few quotations to indicate the kind of parallel ideas and puzzles that he was working with. So from Molly, "Don't wait to be hunted to hide. That's always been my motto. To restore silence is the role of objects. To him who has nothing, it is forbidden not to relish filth. Yes, there were times when I forgot not only who I was, but that I was, forgot to be." And from Maloney Dies, "Nothing is more real than nothing. He who has waited long enough will wait forever. And there comes the hour when nothing more can happen and nobody more can come, and all is ended but the waiting that knows itself in vain." And from The Unnameable, "I, of whom I know nothing, I know my eyes are open because of the tears that pour from them unceasingly. Yes, in my life, since we must call it so, there were three things: the inability to speak, the inability to be silent, and solitude. That's what I've had to make the best of." There are all sorts of quotations that I could have drawn from the three prose works, which again, I think it's fair to say, are really very difficult. But I think what they do convey is Beckett's really very bleak philosophical musings when he wrote the play. Of course, the play he describes as a tragicomedy, and there's plenty of comedy that can be brought out in production, as we'll see in a moment. Now, one way in which people have grappled with this play is to appeal to allegory, and allegory is often described as extended metaphor. It's the idea that you can read a piece, you can see recurring themes or symbols, and you can read those in effect as a code and crack the code and see that the play is actually about something much more rational and much more reasonable. And all sorts of allegories of this play have been proposed, from the psychological to the philosophical to the homoerotic to the theological. And there's not much time to explore these at any length, and I don't think it would be worth it, because I don't think this is the right way to approach the play. But it's important for my argument just to mention one or two. So politically, the play's been proposed as an allegory of the Cold War, the resistance in France, and the Irish problem. And in all these, it's a matter, crudely speaking, of the confrontation of the powerful, Pozzo with his assistant Lucky, and the powerless Vladimir and Estragon. Then Freudian and Jungian interpretations have been proposed. Freud's triple psyche, the ego, the id, and the superego, are kind of transposed onto the play. And Godot, which of course is Estragon's pet name, is read as ego, ego. So take the E away, and you get gogo, ego, ego, gogo. And Didi, which is Vladimir's pet name, is Didi, id, id. Again, if you bracket the D, as it were. And Pozzo is proposed as the superego. Pozzo and Lucky, in this allegorical reading, are seen as duplications, just Estragon, Vladimir over again. And so a critic like Ducour concludes that the play is a metaphor for the pointlessness of existence, where salvation is awaited by an external force and the self is incapable of self-knowledge. But I'm not sure one needs all the complex psychological aspects of his interpretation to come to that conclusion. Jung proposes a quadruple soul, which is paired in twos, the ego and the shadow, and the persona and the soul's image, which may be the anima or the animus. And the shadow contains emotion that's been repressed by the ego. So in this schema, Lucky is the shadow of the dominant Pozzo. And Lucky's monologue in Act 1 is a pouring forth of his repressed unconscious. Estragon's name has been proposed as a cognate, that's to say linguistically very closely related to estrogen, estragon, estrogen, which is the female hormone. And therefore some critics have described his personality as essentially the feminine one. He's poetic, he's sensitive, he's irrational. And Vladimir, by contrast, as the masculine one, rational, intellectual, and contemplative. Well, if any of you are feminists, you may think that this is rather an unsatisfactory way of going about things. Philosophical interpretations have included existential, allegorical readings based on Kierkegaard and Albert Camus, where obviously in L'Étranger and Le Mythe de Sisyphe, so the outsider, the stranger, and the myth of Sisyphus, various existential ideas are played out. Another philosophical reading would be Eslin's, who wrote the seminal work, The Theatre of the Absurd, and he was the first to propose that the avant-garde theatre in the 50s and 60s in France could best be understood as absurdist, about the absurdity of human existence and human life. There's also been an ethical reading of the play, which is perhaps the one people are least familiar with. In it, Godot represents compassion, but compassion will not be given until the characters behave ethically. And as there's violence done to various characters in the play and the other characters don't rally to protect the weak one, they're clearly not behaving ethically, and therefore Godot is not going to come. Only if they abandon their hardened hearts will they be able to pursue purposeful lives. Theologically, of course, well, there are lots of biblical references in the play, including the story of the two thieves. The tree has often been seen representative of the cross. And there's a good deal of religious allegory in the play. And some have taken this further and claimed that Godot is actually God. Well, Beckett denied this. And given that the play was written in French, Godot is not the French for God. It does have anything to do with Dieu, the French for God. And so this seems far-fetched and reductive. Claims for the play's homoeroticism depend on the fact that the cast is all male, which is very unusual for a play, on the loving relationship between Vladimir and Estragon, with talk of a sort of ideal honeymoon at one point, and critics have also pointed to Estragon sucking on the carrot. Well, my view is that the absence of women in the play might really have more to do with ensuring that there's no potential for new life, no potential for new birth, no potential for renewal. I think a more persuasive philosophical reading is one that has been proposed much more recently by Leo Bassani, who talks about art as part of what he describes as a culture of redemption. And his idea is that the repetition of certain kinds of experience in art brings a kind of meaning and humanity to what might otherwise be meaningless experience. The value of negative images is somehow transmuted into something positive. What interests Bassani is the question, can art have a redemptive force? Now, these various allegories are proposed on the basis of the text as opposed to a production of the play. But the text is only the starting point. And as an author, Beckett's been categorized in various different ways, as a modernist, as an absurdist, as an existentialist, and so on. But what I'd like to argue is that in many ways, when Godot is actually produced as theatre, in other words, when we have lighting and makeup and action and all the things that are part of the fabric, the complex fabric of theatre, then I think the play can actually strike us as surprisingly classical. And this in terms of balance. The play is in 2 acts. If it were in 3 or 5, there could be a sense of complication and resolution. As 2 acts, it's rather like 2 mirrors placed one against the other, producing a sort of endless succession of repeated images. The characters are in 2 pairs. We've got Estragon and Vladimir, and Pozzo and Lucky. And in terms of stagecraft, most productions make a great deal of darkness and light, of black and white. Many productions are monochrome. The characters are either standing up on their feet, or they're down on their knees, or their bottoms. And there's a very clear vertical contrast between Vladimir, who's the more intellectual and who plays with his hat on his head, and Estragon, who is the more childlike and instinctive, who plays with his boots, his feet. Balance underscores the dialogue, hence the frequency of antiphrasis, these exchanges that are incomplete. The mood's either upbeat, however strained, or despairing. The play avoids the usual kind of linguistic richness, and the dialogue is often fragmentary, exploiting sticomythia, this sequence of single alternating lines or half-lines. As I said earlier, Beckett described the English version of the play as tragicomedy, a balance of comedy and tragedy. And this sense of balance is shot through so many dimensions of the play that I think it leaves the audience in a state of anticipation. Nothing's ever really answered. Now, Beckett once claimed that his favourite word was perhaps. And when Beckett was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969, part of the speech in his honour stated, "He has transmuted the destitution of modern man into his exaltation. Destitution and exaltation presented in perfect balance." Beckett was brought up a Christian, and he often quoted St. Augustine. The familiar statement, "Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Do not presume, one of the thieves was damned." For Vladimir, within the play, a 50-50 chance is, as he says, a reasonable percentage. What could be better balanced than 50-50? It leads to a kind of irresolution, and that irresolution tempts us to interpret. It tempts us not simply to allow the play to communicate with us in all its mysterious ways, as music might, or as a great building might. We feel we need to somehow decode it. And in many ways, I think what Beckett's interested in is our incapacity not to want to find more specific meaning. Could it be that this is a play which is actually an allegory of allegory? We can't engage with language in the way we can engage with other arts because we need to find a different kind of meaning. Well, when Beckett was asked by Alan Schneider, the producer I mentioned a little earlier, who is Godot, he answered, "If I knew, I would have said so in the play." And when people speculated in conversation with the playwright about its meaning, Beckett would reply simply, "Why people have to complicate a thing so simple, I can't make out." Well, do we take him at his word, or feel infuriated that he remains so obtuse, maybe, so tantalizing? Well, I think we take him at his word. What Waiting for Godot is about, in my view, is the comic but perhaps equally tragic human need for meaning, our thirst, our hunger for meaning. And as soon as language is pared down to a simple high-frequency lexis, and action is limited, and the stage is almost bare, we can't help but read different aspects of theatre as symbolic. And then to ask, what are they symbolic of? The tree, then, is no longer a tree. We ask, what does it symbolize? Godot is no longer a mystery we can live with, but a mystery we feel an urgent need to solve. Beckett, when asked to compare literature and music, always deemed that music won out. And music doesn't mean. Beckett isn't the only author to feel very uneasy about the idea of interpretation, about the idea that you can write something and then people want somehow, as I say, to decode it rather than simply engaging with it. And I think one of the most direct and succinct articulations of this is a wonderful poem by Archibald MacLeish, which he wrote in 1926, which is simply called Ars Poetica, the art of poetry. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases, twig by twig, the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses, and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. In my next and final lecture of this 3-year cycle of the mysteries of reading and writing, I'll be exploring Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing. And Stoppard, like almost every other playwright after Beckett, greatly admired the author of Waiting for Godot. And the obvious debts to Beckett in later playwrights' work also, I think, help to illuminate the originality of Godot. So when we come to look at Stoppard's The Real Thing, we'll also be looking at how a later playwright used, adjusted the work of an earlier playwright who he admired enormously. He claimed that Beckett, and I quote, liberated something for anybody writing plays. And the American Edward Albee claimed, and I quote, if a playwright is uninfluenced by Samuel Beckett, then he's a damn fool or irresponsible. So before we move on to some questions, I'd like to show 2 clips from 2 very different productions of the play. This, I think, allows us to see that there's a difference between trying to make sense of a text and simply engaging with the communicative act of theatre when it's very well done, as I think it is in both these. The first is from a 2001 film of the play, and the second is Sean Mathias's 213 production. The first's about 5 minutes, I think, and the second less than 2.
Nothing to be done.
I'm beginning to come round to that opinion. All my life, I've tried to put it from me, saying, Vladimir, be reasonable. You haven't yet tried everything. And I resumed the struggle. So, there you are again.
Am I?
I'm glad to see you back. I thought you were gone forever.
Me too.
Together again at last. We'll have to celebrate this. But how? Get up till I embrace you.
Not now, not now.
May one inquire where His Highness spent the night?
In a ditch.
A ditch? Where?
Over there.
And they didn't beat you?
Beat me. Certainly they beat me.
The same lot as usual?
The same, I don't know.
When I think of it, all these years, but for me, where would you be? You'd be nothing more than a little heap of bones at the present minute, no doubt about it.
What of it?
That's too much for one man. On the other hand, what's the good of losing heart now? That's what I say. We should have thought of it 1,000,000 years ago, when the world was young.
Stop blathering and help me off with this bloody thing.
Hand in hand from the top of the Eiffel Tower, among the first. We were presentable in those days. Now it's too late. They wouldn't even let us up.
Oh.
What are you doing?
Taking off my boot. Did that never happen to you?
Boots must be taken off every day. I'm tired telling you that. Why don't you listen to me?
Help me.
It hurts.
Hurts. He wants to know if it hurts.
No one ever suffers but you. I don't count. I'd like to hear what you'd say if you had what I have.
It hurts?
Hurts. He wants to know if it hurts.
You might button it all the same.
True. Never neglect the little things of life.
And what do you expect? You always wait until the last moment.
The last moment. Hope deferred. Make it the something sick. Who said that?
Why don't you help me?
Sometimes I feel it coming all the same. Then I go all queer. How shall I say? Relieved, and at the same time, appalled. Appalled. Funny? Nothing to be done. Well?
Nothing.
Show.
There's nothing to show.
I'll try and put it on again.
I'll air it for a bit.
There's man all over for you, blaming on his boots the faults of his feet. This is getting alarming. One of the thieves was saved. It's a reasonable percentage. Go.
What?
Suppose we repented.
Repented what?
Oh, we wouldn't have to go into the details.
Our being born?
One daren't even laugh anymore.
Oh, dreadful privation.
Merely smile. Yeah, it's not the same thing. Nothing to be done. Go.
What is it?
Do you ever read the Bible?
The Bible? Yeah, I must have taken a look at it.
Do you remember the Gospels?
I remember the maps of the Holy Land. Colour they were. Very pretty. The Dead Sea was pale blue. The very look of it made me thirsty. That's where we'll go, I used to say. That's where we'll go for our honeymoon. We'll swim. We'll be happy.
You should have been a poet.
I was. Isn't that obvious?
Where was I? How's your foot?
Swelling visibly.
Ah, yes, 2 thieves. Do you remember the story?
No.
Shall I tell it to you?
No.
It'll pass the time. 2 thieves crucified at the same time as our Savior.
And then a really very different production.
Say, I am happy. I am happy. So am I. So am I. We are happy. We are happy. What do we do now that we're happy? You should have been a poet.
Oh, I was, isn't that obvious? Que voulez-vous?
I beg your pardon?
Que voulez-vous?
Ah, que voulez-vous?
Exactly.
How does it fit me?
How would I know?
Well, that passed the time.
It would have passed in any case.
Beckett wrote, "To find a form that accommodates the mess, that is the task of the artist now. Words might fail, but music," he contended, never did. Thank you.